Throughout time, mankind has always held a keen fascination for those types of people who seem to be able to heal others with their minds alone. From saints to charlatans and from witch doctors to Reiki masters, the literature is filled of stories of people who've undergone seemingly miraculous recoveries from very serious and sometimes terminal illnesses as a result of the interventions of these so-called healers. But I don't believe in miracles. Or to paraphrase Einstein, either everything's a miracle or nothing's a miracle. But either way, when someone experiences a spontaneous remission of an end-stage metastatic cancer because someone halfway around the world is transmitting loving energies and intentions and thereby triggering a healing response, then something is happening biophysiologically that we need to take a serious look at. This film is an attempt to take a look at these situations and try to understand what might be happening. And while we don't have all the answers, nobody really does, hopefully there's enough information provided here to provide your imagination with enough data for you to draw your own conclusions. The deeper we look into this and the more research that's been done on the phenomena, the more likely it seems that the answers to all of our questions about healing with consciousness lie beyond space and time.
My name is Gary Zukov. I'm a grandfather, I'm a Harvard graduate, I'm a former Army officer, I'm an author, I'm a co-founder of the Seat of the Soul Institute with Linda Francis, and I write books, and I write books with Linda Francis, and together we give talks and events. And the purpose of all of this is to help people become aware that there is an amazing, unprecedented, huge, huger than huge transformation that's occurring in the human species. It has nothing that can compare with it. It is the expansion of our perception beyond the limitations of the five senses, beyond what we can see and taste and hear and touch and smell. And this is a game changer. What do I mean by a game changer? I mean our evolutionary path has shifted onto a new track. Everything before served our evolution until recently. Now we are in new terrain, and we don't have maps. We are the map makers. We are the explorers. It doesn't make us special or better. It just means that we're coming a little earlier than some will come later. But this transformation in a perceptual capability will touch everyone within a few generations. We're on the ground floor of something amazing and great.
Yeah, we are definitely living in a time of paradigm shift. It's happening on many fronts. You can look at something like social emotional intelligence and, pick up the Harvard Business Review and see it being discussed there. So there has been a shift. I think also understanding the nature of healing. People are becoming much more aware of the innate qualities within us that can help to invite in a healing response. We know that there are many medical cures for things, but maybe what they really are is a trigger for the individual's innate capacity to heal. And when I say heal, that may mean to die in a graceful way. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're cured. Because we will all die. All of life forms will die. And so it's how do we embrace that quality and the cycle of life such that we imbue it with as much purpose and passion as we possibly can.
This transformation is so huge, so magnificent, that it challenges everything that we can think. And I'm not talking figuratively or poetically. It challenges everything that we can think, because our experience as humans is now entering the domain of non-physical reality. And the mind cannot grasp that. It cannot explain it. It cannot track with it, because our intellect was designed to accompany the five senses. It takes data that the five senses provided, and it compares those data and analyzes them and makes conclusions that will help us survive and be more comfortable. That's all the intellect can do. Now, I'm saying that not in a dismissive way, because I wrote a book on quantum physics, and I love to think, and I love to use my mind, but I know the limitations of it, just as I know the limitations of language, because I love language. Some languages cannot be calibratable into other languages. You have to learn the different language, for example, English and Navajo. Well, the intellect, the experiences that come from beyond the personality, the experiences that are now entering human perception and becoming part of what and who we are, come from beyond the mind. As this transformation takes hold, we still remember our zip codes, we still text, send and receive email. We're still part of the world, physical, technological, emotional, and more. It's the more that I love telling people about. Not because I'm a guide there, but because we're all exploring, and that more is a domain beyond time, space, matter, and duality. We don't leave time, space, matter, and duality as we become aware of this larger dimension of experience and existence. But it changes our understanding, our emotions, and the way that we interact in this world of physical reality.
One of the most important aspects of the evolution we're facing right now is to own the reality that we are more than just as physical bodies, that there's a spiritual component to us, an energy, a field that goes on whether the body is here or not. We have talked about this in religion for generations, millennia, but nobody has really owned the fact that, yes, you are a spiritual entity, that we have focused ourselves in this physical plane and have lost our connection. So the evolution is open up that we are greater than this physical body.
There's an increasing wealth of information, data from various disciplines that supports this idea that our consciousness is something more than our physicality. We can see it in the areas of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, reincarnation, mediumship, psychic phenomena. All of these provide sort of pieces of a puzzle that are beginning to reveal a new understanding of our human potentials.
Everyone needs to know about this expansion in consciousness, because millions of us are experiencing it. And of those millions, and by now I would suggest hundreds of millions of people, it might be helpful to them to know that they're not insane. It might be helpful to them to know that there actually is a dimension to themselves that is not physical, that existed before they were born, and that will continue to exist after they die. It's healthy to experience these things. It's healthy to begin to see the world and our immediate circumstances as meaningful, not as random, but as offering us continual opportunities to grow spiritually. And that means to become emotionally aware and self-responsible. And these opportunities are always perfect for each individual involved, given the wisdom of the choices that they've made.
When it comes to understanding alternative health practices, especially healing with consciousness, there's no doubt that there's an awful lot of woo-woo out there, and anybody can charge you $150 to light a few candles, play some New Age music, and wave their hands over your body. But how do these healers know what they say they know? And how do you know who to trust? According to most scientists, the only way to definitively know anything is through a rigorous, peer-reviewed, independently verifiable process. But there are other ways of acquiring knowledge. And because consciousness lies outside the boundary conditions set by science, we're going to have to rely on another method outside of controlled studies.
So a problem here with controlled studies is that you're looking at one variable in isolation. And we don't live in isolation. We have multiple variables in our life constantly. And so a view such as Ayurvedic medicine or Qigong, Chinese medicine, acupuncture, they look at the whole person and not at a single dose response, but rather at an entire gestalt. And we miss that when we take the controlled experiment point of view.
If you go back to the days of the Greek, there were two pathways to knowledge. One was logos, which means looking from yourself outwards at nature, and there was mythos. Mythos was looking inwards of self at that aspect of nature.
So controlled experiments are a great way to learn about a very specific phenomenon. But it's not the only way to know things. And we scientists are often blind to those other ways of knowing things. What are the other ways to understand the world and to know things? One of them is to look at ancient wisdom. Ancient wisdom has evolved over a period of a long time, and it's tried and true. People have observed over years and generations and decades and millennia whether Ayurvedic medicine, Indian medicine, works, and what's good and what's bad. And so we might find a drug in Western medicine that will reduce our blood pressure, but we don't know in the long run what all the side effects are. Alternatively, in Ayurvedic medicine, the effect of various herbs and supplements has been observed over millennia. And so this is ancient wisdom. It's something we need to take seriously.
There's multiple ways of knowing. And we have in Western society privileged the rational. And yet we know that there are many ways of gaining truth about the world, whether it's some kind of altered state of consciousness that traditional societies have relied upon. Dreams have the potential to provide deep meaning for us and understanding of genuine problems, breakthroughs. There are somatic ways of knowing, that feeling in our body that can give us a sense that this is a good path, this is not. You know, there are these qualities William James described as noetic, states of insight, unplumbed by the discursive intellect, all inarticulate though they remain, and yet they carry with them a curious sense of authority. So these are qualities that have been excluded from mainstream science, and yet they propel us to great works of art, to great sources of inspiration, and ultimately, even within science, to great breakthroughs, because people who can move themselves from that strictly rational intellectual mind into these alternative ways of knowing and being have the potential to be more full and inclusive.
Back in the 90s, I began to receive information from an angelic guide. This information came giving me specific physical locations of acupuncture points, which did not exist in traditional acupuncture. And I was then able to prove unequivocally that stimulating these particular points had very specific biochemical responses. For instance, I can selectively raise your dehydroepiandrosterone, the most important hormone in the human body, by stimulating one particular circuit. Or, stimulating another one, I can raise oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and on and on it goes. I believe that this kind of result certainly proves that communicating with, if you will, with another dimension of being is about as real as anything we have physically.
This is actually how science works. First you come up with some phenomenal idea that came from somewhere. It's very interesting because scientists and artists don't work in this realm. Scientists and artists work in a different realm and bring the information back into this realm. And so the idea is, Almost every scientist who has made a major change, even the finding of benzene as a ring, was due to a dream, a snake biting its own tail, going on its own circle, led a chemist to understand that. What was the point? The ideas didn't first come from the work. The ideas first came from the consciousness, and then were translated into the science.
I can't always distinguish whether something is coming to me intuitively or being programmed into me from the guide. In fact, I once asked my guide, is that my idea or yours? And the answer was, where do you think all your ideas come from? I put them out. You may or may not receive them. So I tend to believe that all creativity is actually tuning into the cosmos, so that whether you're a poet or an artist or a scientist, when you have a creative idea, you're actually getting information from multi-dimensions. In my case, as far as I could tell, it's primarily from an angelic guide.
Where did the information come from in the field about the benzene? Where did the Watson and Crick story come from? It came from the field. It came from before. Did it evolve in that field, or was it in that field? That is the most important question. To me, the information is in the field, and when we're open to it, we can download that information. And this is really the opening that we have to understand, is that we are much greater than these physical entities that we see.
In 1999, I was on sabbatical, and I happened to see on the website of a quantum physicist at a university I was visiting, I happened to see that he mentioned parapsychology. I thought, that's very strange. Why would a quantum physicist be wasting his time with that? So I contacted him. And to make a long story short, I ended up spending my entire sabbatical reading through his library on parapsychology and psi phenomena. And I was totally blown away by the fact that there was substantial evidence, lots of peer-reviewed studies in support of these things that I had thought couldn't exist.
It turns out that the Orthodox science community has rejected this body of information for 150 years. It's been available, and they've rejected it because it's not internally self-consistent with the phenomena of the distance-time only realm.
Psi phenomena contains 4 different phenomena. They include the 3 that are extrasensory perception and 1 more. The 3 that are extrasensory perception are precognition, clairvoyance, and telepathy. The 4th one is psychokinesis, being able to move something at a distance. I prefer that terminology to parapsychology, perhaps because I'm coming from a more physics perspective than a psychology perspective.
It's a shame that most radical scientists know nothing, virtually, of this body of knowledge. Those days are coming to an end, however, because we're realizing that these are peer-reviewed studies published in good journals and have been replicated by independent observers in laboratories around the world. We're facing a huge revolution in thought about the nature of consciousness. The studies have such statistical power that they are forcing us to acknowledge that our consciousness can operate outside our individual brain and body.
At this point, if you take a look at the studies that have been published, and you look at the data, and you look at the quality of the studies, there's no question. These phenomena exist, finished. The question now is, how can we reconcile the existence of this with our current understanding of science? We want to understand it. We don't want to prove it anymore.
You know, I thought that years ago, when we had what I consider irrefutable evidence that consciousness can make a difference in the world, and that healing is a real effect I thought that after this data became known, the battle over this area would simply be over. It hasn't worked that way because this is such a threatening phenomenon that a lot of materialistically oriented physicians just want to look in the other direction.
In the case of the Paralab, for example, that looked at consciousness effects on random number generators, precognition, that type of thing, the cumulative database is greater than 1 in 1 trillion. So the question becomes not, do the scientists know what they're doing? Are they just doing bad research? But really, what's going on here? How do we explain and account for these phenomena?
I had the opportunity to talk to thousands of medical students and college students about these ideas. Most of them have no trouble imagining that these phenomena are real. They often say, what's the matter with your generation? You know, I think they see us as sort of old fogies who just can't get with the new images of consciousness.
With psi phenomena right now, we find that we can use our minds to affect properties of materials. And we can interact with each other's psychically in various ways. Does that destroy physics? No, it doesn't destroy physics. Just like Newtonian physics still stood after Max Planck looked at the ultraviolet catastrophe. But it's this little opening. It's this little opening that says, okay, something isn't quite complete in our understanding of physics, and we need to take into account the fact that our consciousness can get in there and affect things.
One of the first and most poignant examples of how the medical profession is missing a key component in their understanding of biology comes from the research scientists themselves, who do studies to understand the effectiveness of their latest drugs. You see, to test a drug for its effectiveness, a research scientist will set up a controlled study where half the patients are given the new drug and the other half are given an inert substance, a sugar pill, that shouldn't have any effect at all on the patient. But much to the amazement of scientists, in study after study, a significant number of patients who receive the sugar cubes also have a healing response triggered. This doesn't make any sense at all scientifically. How is that even possible?
You know, healing is a great mystery. We really don't understand how it is that we can heal a wound or correct an imbalance. We now know more and more about the placebo, and yet that remains a huge mystery. How is it that you can take an inert substance and not only can it create changes in the body, but it actually understands the cascade of responses that are necessary to trigger a particular kind of healing? You know, these are the great mysteries. This is the opportunity we have in our time.
We know, for example, that the placebo effect in medicine is often as powerful as the drugs that are created to cure those maladies. So what's going on there? Placebo effect is very close to consciousness effects. It could be, for example, that knowing more about how consciousness works in the physical world, and indeed our bodies, could help to explain how the placebo effect works, and down the line help us develop more and more effective intervention techniques, whether that be under the aegis of alternative healing, or whether that be under the aegis of improved conventional medical treatments.
Let's take the second most common illness in the world, published by World Health Organization, depression. The best antidepressant drug is 42% effective. The best, with a 25% complication rate. Placebo, 35%, so, the best is 7% better than placebo with a 25% complication rate. That's pretty serious to me. When I can get 80 to 85% of people out of depression safely without drugs. So my approach is to take things that can be proven to be safe, and if they work better than a drug, that's the way to do it.
The placebo is commonly understood, I guess by convention or habit, as a psychological thing. So let's say you take a drug and it has no active agent, and you take the drug and the drug produces something. And it's thought to be suggestion, and then then they're safe. It was just suggestion. I mean, I think a reasonable question is, if it is the mind, had the mind do that? You know, and I actually know a couple of companies who are trying to develop placebos as a therapeutic delivery system. It even turns out that you can write on a pill, placebo, and it still has the effect. I mean, that's simply wonderful. So I started to look into placebo effects, and it turns out there's dirty little secrets. Almost nobody knows this. You take a group of, well, let's say it's humans. You take a group of humans and you split them up into two groups, and you give them some stimulant or drug, and then at the end, you compare the group that had it and the group that didn't have it. So they're taking a pill, but it's got something in it. They're taking a pill, but it's inert. How is this group different than this group? And it turns out that placebos get stronger with repetition. And it turns out placebos get stronger with repetition anywhere in the world. So if I give a test of a particular drug, and there's a placebo group, and then the test is replicated in Australia, theirs will be slightly stronger. And then I try it in Denmark, and it'll be slightly stronger again, until eventually you kind of even out at about 80% of the effect of the active drug. And people think, well, it's just suggestion, as if that explained anything. Well, you can think of, try to make placebo effects go away by just saying it's suggestion, but here's an exception to that. If I give X dosage to this group, I get X placebo response. If I make it 2X, it's a 2X placebo response over here. Now, how do you do that if it's suggestion? I mean, think this through. It doesn't make any sense at all. It does make sense if the groups that are physically separate are really bonded together. So when I give a pill here, I'm really giving the active agent also over here.
Beginning in about the 1950s, scientists began to wonder if they could study things like psychic healing in a laboratory setting under randomized controlled circumstances. So there were early studies by Bernard Grad, for example, looking at the healing touch and whether he could inflict small wounds on mice and then have a healer attempt to heal that wound faster than a control wound, and found very positive results using that kind of methodology. Lawrence Lashan has done a lot of work attempting to look at local healing as well as non-local healing. We find the principles in a variety of different kind of alternative healing practices: Reiki, therapeutic touch, distant intention, subtle energies. All of these have some qualities that involve a kind of non-local component. Beginning in the 80s, I worked with William Broad at the Mind Science Foundation, and we developed a laboratory protocol where we could study psychic healing under these well-controlled scientific circumstances. And after 14 formal experiments, found significant statistical evidence that people's intention actually had a measurable impact on another person's physiology, even at a distance. These experiments have now been replicated in laboratories all over the world. And so there is now a body of data that supports the idea that our intention not only influences our own mind-body, but it can potentially reach out and influence another mind-body, even at a distance, and even under conditions where the other person has no idea that the attempt is happening.
So Grad, who I consider to be the father of all healing research, I mean, everything is a footnote to Grad. I'm a footnote to Grad. I don't know of a school of healing that couldn't be traced in one way or another to Grad. And here was this guy in the 1950s and 60s doing control studies on plant growth and wound healing, and he was primarily studying the Hungarian healer Oscar Estebany. And Estebany, who was not trained by anybody, was brought into Grad's lab in Montreal, and here he was under controlled conditions, putting his hands around plants and treating animals that had been wounded and doing all these other kinds of things that went way beyond anecdote. So Grad had control groups, followed strict scientific, rigorous methods, and I was just utterly riveted, because here was something you can, in fact, study this stuff. It wasn't just stories.
I think that biofeedback was the beginning of proving the body-mind connection. Dr. Elmer Green's original study was on migraine. Migraine is a fairly common disease, something like 17% of women and 9% of men, and can be quite disabling. And long-term, an 84% success rate in people doing temperature biofeedback, gaining control over the circulation of the hands, scientifically based. Because in general, what happens in a migraine is the hands become cold and the blood is transferred into the brain, causing the pressure and the headache. I mean, that's the simplest way of putting it, but it worked. 84%. No drug in the world can be 84%. Many other studies with biofeedback training proving much the same thing, mentally capability of training the body physiologically, chemically, and ultimately physically.
No one actually knows specifically how these effects occur, but we know that they occur. And this brings up a hugely important issue. Many skeptics say, well, nobody knows the mechanism for how this could occur, therefore we're justified in ignoring the data. Well, that's called bad science. Particularly in medicine, we've known that something happens before we've had a clue about how it happens.
So, for example, what's gravity? You know, I'm reasonably certain there is gravity, but what is it? If you put 10 physicists in a room, they'll just start killing each other over what it is. So one thinks it's the bending of space-time, and the other thinks it's gravitons, and the other thinks it's, but there's still gravity, and I can use gravity to do stuff. I may not really understand healing, and I've done a lot of brain research, for example, but can you use it anyway? It's still there. Since I know it's there, can we reverse engineer this and come up with a therapeutic application? I think that would be kind of fun.
When it comes to understanding the relationship between consciousness and the material world, you can fit all the different theories from theology, philosophy, psychology, and science into just 3 different categories. The first one is called materialism, otherwise known as scientific reductionism. This is the theory that all of modern science is based on. And this theory says that there's nothing beyond the material world, and that consciousness is simply a byproduct or an epiphenomena of brain function. The second category is known as panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness permeates all of creation and coexists with the material world to provide us with the experiences that we have. The third idea is known as idealism, otherwise known as the primacy of consciousness, or the idea that consciousness is fundamental to existence. Idealism says that before the universe, before creation, there was consciousness, and that everything we experience is a byproduct of consciousness. And while idealism could never be proven scientifically, we can rule out both materialism and panpsychism by looking at the data, leaving idealism as the only logical conclusion.
As consciousness goes to these deeper levels, smaller scale in the universe, but also higher levels of consciousness at the same time. In other words, a greater intensity, briefer time, more non-local, interacting with consciousness all around, it does become more and more like idealism, where we're all one and interconnected, entangled, and closer, in fact, one with the Platonic values embedded in the universe. So at that level of the scale, consciousness becomes more like idealism, I must admit.
When it comes to talking about consciousness, you can give people research papers and hope that they read and understand the data. Or you can point out the obvious. You can say, look, doubt that everything around you exists. Doubt even that I exist. But the one thing that you can't doubt is that you exist, that you have a subjective experience. So the idea that our minds or consciousness is an illusion of the brain begs the question, an illusion to whom? You see, you need consciousness to be able to experience this illusion of consciousness. So the materialist argument that the mind is nothing more than an epiphenomena or an illusion actually presupposes the very existence of the thing it's trying to deny.
The materialist view that consciousness emerges from complex computation has several problems. It doesn't make testable predictions as to how consciousness can come from complex computation. Even materialists like Christoph Koch are now invoking some form of panpsychism, that consciousness is intrinsic to matter. It is completely deterministic and leaves out anything like free will, and it doesn't distinguish between a computer or a complex system like a weather pattern and our brains. We know our brains produce consciousness. We don't believe, or there's no evidence, that a weather pattern or a computer produces consciousness. So that dog don't hunt, as they say in certain parts of the world. I don't think it works at all, even though it's the standard view. I think that view kind of dismisses or glosses over consciousness, or gets rid of it altogether, or belittles it, or trivializes consciousness. That view doesn't take consciousness seriously.
So the idea that consciousness is the basis of reality as opposed to a materialistic view is currently fashionable. It's a new age view even. And so I, with my materialistic training, wonder, is it really right? Or the materialistic view that I grew up in really has its origins in Descartes and a Cartesian perspective of the world. And if you look deeper, if you look behind that, if you look at ancient wisdom all the way up through the Renaissance, actually the materialistic view was a minority view. The more consciousness-based view was actually the majority view. Not that the majority is always right, but in fact, we're returning back to the insightful perspectives that we had in the past.
We have this overwhelming body of evidence that's looking at the effects of consciousness. That's the interface between mind and the physical world, the shadows on Plato's cave, if you will. The challenge for the future is how we can look more fundamentally at what consciousness itself actually is. And if we assume that consciousness is primary, actually the only way to study consciousness is with consciousness.
If we assume that consciousness is truly fundamental, that it works through the brain but isn't produced by the brain, and that it can do things out there in the world, we're faced with some real challenges. Because the only thing that helps us put consciousness under the microscope is consciousness itself. You know, there are ways that philosophers have described this dilemma. One of my favorite philosophers, Alan Watts, who was a Zen scholar, said that trying to understand consciousness through any other method than consciousness is like trying to bite your own teeth with your teeth, or seeing your eyes with your eyes. The physical approaches simply don't work. The proper way to study consciousness is through consciousness. Any other way is doomed to failure.
The problem with using consciousness to study consciousness is that objectivity has always been the hallmark of science. But if we assume that consciousness is primary, we have to think more closely about what objectivity and subjectivity actually are.
We've shown that consciousness can affect the state of physiology and chemistry and biology of a person. If that's so, it's probably impossible to perform any kind of experiment dealing with human beings and life in general whose outcome is not affected to some degree by the thoughts and views of the experimenter.
Karl Popper, who's considered by many to be one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, is famous for popularizing the notion of falsifiability to define a good scientific theory. According to Popper, a theory was useless unless it could be tested for falseness. For example, reincarnation, which could be instrumental in helping us come to a much deeper understanding of everything from evolutionary biology to sociology and psychology, isn't a valid scientific theory because we can't create testable predictions with it. Meanwhile, materialism actually is a theory which is falsifiable. In fact, it's been falsified. There's been countless studies in the field of consciousness research that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that consciousness lies somewhere outside of the physical plane. This is very strange. There's a mountain of evidence that proves that reincarnation is a legitimate phenomena, and yet it's been relegated to the world of superstition and pseudoscience. And meanwhile, materialism, which is a theory that's been proven to be incorrect, marches on unabated. It's critical in the world of research science that we get our first principles correct. All of our theories, our research, our experiments, and even our funding is based on our first principles. And if we're going to understand what healing with consciousness is, it's vital that we understand what consciousness is, or at least at a minimum, what it isn't. And the research proves that consciousness is not a byproduct of brain function.
We find that there's this kind of slippery slope within science that can move easily towards scientism. Anybody who refutes or challenges a particular materialist assumption is considered to be a heretic or, a pseudoscientist or, a wacky person. And yet what we're discovering more and more every day is that there is a paradigm that's shifting. And we're discovering that there are these qualities of our inner experience that are valid for scientific research and pursuit. And that we now know from data collected all over the world that there's evidence to support the idea that we have these capacities to transcend our physical being, and that perhaps our consciousness is something more than an epiphenomenon or byproduct of the brain, but actually has these capacities to reach out and engage the world and to connect us in ways that, Newtonian physics hasn't allowed us to understand yet.
A lot of people in science are quite squeamish about acknowledging that consciousness can change the state of the physical world. They think that this probably is a menace to science. But when quantum physics and relativity came along, it didn't do away with Newtonian science. We can still put men on the moon and predict eclipses using Newton's laws, but yet we have a more accurate, subtle understanding of how things work if we go in the direction of relativity, quantum mechanics. In the same sense, if we acknowledge that consciousness works, which we're obliged to do because of the new data, it doesn't mean that we have to toss out everything we've known up till now. We just simply have to see it in a different light. Science becomes richer, not more poverty-stricken. And so there's everything to gain and almost nothing to lose by acknowledging the new data that consciousness can make a difference in the world.
I've spoken to medical schools, I've spoken to scientific groups, I've spoken all over the place, and they give me a hard time, which is appropriate, but at the end they go, we can't find a flaw. Those who will take the time to go after it, so far, haven't found a flaw. I'm not afraid of the flaws. I'm sure there are flaws, I can't find them. If someone can show me where I'm wrong, I'm happy to be wrong. If someone can show me that my conclusions are unwarranted, I'm fine with that. I'm not trying to defend anything. I'm following a stream of data which may lead to some pretty interesting results. One, it may end up inadvertently questioning the legitimacy of experimental design. Two, it may come up with a weird explanation for placebos. Three, we might be able to engineer some therapies using a weird, unorthodox method to reverse engineer it. And we don't know what else it'll work on. So we seem clinically to be able to affect some things very well. So in addition to cancer, where most of my research has been, Alzheimer's. This stuff works really well on Alzheimer's. Could we reverse engineer an Alzheimer's cure also? Could we reverse engineer? I mean, these are interesting questions. They're worth going after.
So is all of physics incorrect? No. We have this one little niggling problem that we know that consciousness can get into some sort of phenomena and affect them, and that's an opening. Where is that opening going to go? Our physics will still stand, but maybe we'll have this same sort of explosion that we had after the advent of the quantum. And maybe we'll have a much deeper understanding. Maybe we'll see that reality itself is consciousness-based. I don't know. I'm actually a conservative scientist, despite everything you may think. And I like to go one step at a time. Let's just see where we're led by the little bit of understanding that we have in psi phenomena. And let's see what that does to physics. I've got a feeling it's going to go far, but let's take it one step at a time.
Sir Isaac Newton was undeniably one of the greatest scientists ever, and most people associate him with having discovered gravity. But that's not really true. We already knew things fell when we dropped them. What Newton's genius was is he was able to describe the force of the apple falling from the tree. He actually came up with calculus, a new form of mathematics, to calculate the force of this apple falling from the tree, and use that same mathematics to accurately predict the motion of the planets around the solar system. He was able to observe one thing in nature and apply what he learned to come up with a model to define how the universe worked. Similarly, in the fields of consciousness studies, there's a wide variety of phenomena that we observe that lie outside of what science can study. And these include everything from reincarnation, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, clairvoyance, telepathy, healing, and a wide variety of other topics. Perhaps in the same way that Newton was able to observe one thing in nature and apply it elsewhere, perhaps if we come up with a model to describe how energetic healing could work, we can use that same model to help us understand how all these phenomena work.
As a conventional biologist, I was really trained in the realm of Newtonian physics, which is a physics based on the physical world and recognizes the invisible energy world, but also recognizes that the two realms don't interact. Therefore, as a biologist, I must focus only on physical mechanisms. So when I'm talking about cell control, I'm actually talking about the physical molecules that do signaling for the cell and organizing the behavior of the cell. And therefore, our focus has always been on the physical realm. In 1925, quantum physics came in and said that this is an error in understanding the universe, that everything is made out of energy, and that energy is really fundamental in shaping the physical realm. So therefore, when I was doing my research, I jumped into the quantum mechanics end of it and started recognizing that invisible forces are primary in shaping the physical world. One important quote that really sums it up is from Albert Einstein, and he said, the field, and the field is the energy, the invisible realm, the field is the sole governing agency of the particle. What he meant by that was that the energy field was the agency that governs the physical realm. And therefore, we have to move out of from focusing on the physical biology and start looking at energetic biology.
I think what's really different about what's coming forward with the new science is that it recognizes a central role of human consciousness. That consciousness is the creator, the co-creator, and consciousness is possibly the most important element. And so if you don't allow for consciousness in any kind of scientific investigation, you're missing the whole point.
One of the interesting aspects of science being Newtonian-based is that we only focus on the material realm. The significance is then we really ignore the invisible realm as not being important. But when you start to bring in the invisible realm, which is energy, that includes thoughts and consciousness and what's going on in the field around us. All of this starts to apply to cells. If you leave those components out of the equation and trying to understand life, then you're really missing the most important part of biology.
The scientific community has given me a hard time. I'm a member, I'm the president of the Society for Scientific Exploration, which is a group of researchers, interested folks in scientific data, about 800 strong around the world, who are not afraid to look into anomalies. They're not believers, they're people who aren't afraid. Most people are afraid. They spend an excessive amount of their time defending their beliefs and are not what I would call true skeptics. The SSE is a group of true skeptics. I'm a skeptic. I don't pretend to know enough to believe anything. So the scientific community, it turns out, largely to my horror, are primarily composed of believers. They believe that my stuff can't be true. Why? Because it can't. Why? Because it can't. Do they look at the data? No. Looking at the data aren't as interesting as defending your beliefs that you know off the top. It can't be. And so if you follow the data, I don't know of anyone who's looked at my data who's been able to come up with a counter-hypothesis.
Once we start to leave behind the nature of the physical body and start to look at there's an energetic field, the field, again, from Einstein's perspective, is what's shaping the physical realm. Rather than trying to change the physical realm, it's much more effective to go out and change the field. And therefore, I say, well, how do you change the energy field? And the answer is not mechanically, but with other forms of energy, because energy interacts, and it's called interference, constructive and destructive interference, where two energies come together and influence each other. How can you create this interference? There are many different ways to get there. So there's not just one process of energy healing. There are varieties of ways of getting there, and yet they all still come down to the same result. They ultimately alter the field, and it's the field that shapes who we are.
So we make assumptions that the way things are is how they've always been. And that's just absolutely not true. There have been major transformations and paradigm shifts throughout history. When we look at what is the nature of science today and the separation between the mind and the body, for example, that was a political deal struck by Descartes with the church at a time when science was trying to gain some foothold. And the church said, okay, well, you're making these discoveries, and I guess we can't stop you, but let's just carve out the territory. So the scientists said, okay, we'll deal with the physical, and the church said, we'll deal with the soul. And we've made this separation as though it's something absolute, when in fact, I think that is one of the fundamental shifts that's happening today.
I'm not going to throw science out just because science is making errors today. I have to recognize that science is an evolving field. It's not static. The problem is when we say this is it and that's its final, that unfortunately is a limitation that is not really supported by the consciousness and awareness of our planet. Everything is always evolving and moving. And this is what we have to recognize. Yesterday's science is evolving into tomorrow's new world.
The problem is not that science has humanity or the intellect in a grip of some kind. There is no problem. There is a circumstance and a change in circumstance. The circumstance is that since our origin as a species, we have been a five-sensory species. Science has come at the very end of this evolutionary development. And it's been given a name, empirical. But empirical means five-sensory. Limits of the five senses apply, or science cannot touch it, think about it, and, here's the thing, even consider it real. But now we're beginning to see that there is much beyond the five senses that is real. And it's undoubtedly real. It's undeniably real. It is experientially real. It is experientially consensual. This doesn't mean that everybody has the same internal experiences, but there are certain dynamics of a new emerging physics that are common and can be explored.
One interesting point in history is Newton. So we know Newton for Newton's laws and the rational perspective that he brought to physics, the materialistic perspective that he brought to physics. But in fact, he spent most of his time doing something quite different. He was an alchemist and spent most of his time looking at alchemy, which really, on a deep level, is not simply a physical process, but it's an interaction of the mental process with physical reality. So he was looking at consciousness-based reality.
The significance of Newton being an alchemist is also related to the fact that Darwin was also a spiritual person. Why is this relevant? The followers of these leaders in science did not adopt their lifestyle beliefs. They just took the critical science and ignored all the metaphysical, spiritual, religious implications of their science and just said, no, it's physical realm, and that both Newton and Darwin were actually becoming senile as they kept expressing beliefs that actually contradicted the conventional science of the time.
The culture of science is inherently conservative in that conservative simply means I'd like to conserve. So I'd like to conserve my way of looking at the world. And so, I mean, there's a joke that science progresses one funeral at a time. Whereas the group that held on to a particular way of looking at the world, they die off, and then a new generation comes up and they didn't know that they weren't allowed to think of the world differently. So the activity of scientists, although data-driven, tend to ask only questions which are within the model that they think works.
There are a number of things that scientists know. For example, we know that there is ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation, and that has to do with electromagnetic fields and how energetic those electromagnetic fields are. And so if you have non-ionizing radiation, which means long wavelength radiation like from cell phones, We know that that cannot do chemistry. That can't hurt you. And yet our knowledge is wrong, because it's coming out that in fact non-ionizing radiation, along with ionizing radiation, can have profound impacts on biological matter and on us. And so there are many things that I knew. I knew, for example, that pans that are coated with Teflon are perfectly safe because Teflon is inert. Any scientist knows that. Well, it's turning out that the fluorine from those pans can cause toxic reactions in people. So I also knew that parapsychology and psychic phenomena are bogus. Any scientist knows that. You don't need to investigate that. It's a known thing.
Most people think of science as an ultimate truth, but the point is that science is just a story. It's an unfolding story that changes chapter by chapter as new discoveries get made. It uses a certain methodology and a certain vantage point, and that vantage point up until now, in the last several centuries, has been materialism. The idea that we are separate things and that we operate in a very well-behaved way according to fixed laws in time and space. That theory is now being proved wrong. New ideas are coming across now that are upending every way that we thought about how the world works.
We've paid a huge price for taking consciousness out of our views of how the world works. We've wrecked the environment. We have fallen prey to an epidemic of greed and selfishness. And I think that if we're going to survive as a species, we're going to have to correct that in a major way. How do we do that? It's by bringing consciousness back into the equations. We no longer say that the world exists out there independent of our thoughts, actions, and behaviors. If we don't get this right, I think our future as a species on this planet is very dismal.
Our minds are like parachutes. They only work when they're open. And many times when talking to scientists about energetic healing, what you'll often hear them say is, well, I don't believe in that. But that's not really what they're saying. What they're really saying is, I disbelieve in that. And a disbelief is really no different from a belief. It's a closed-minded way of saying, I've already got my mind made up. Don't confuse me with the data. The opposite of a disbelief isn't belief. The opposite of disbelief is wonder, just like the opposite of belief is wonder. And wonder is one of the most important characteristics a scientist can have. It's a wide-eyed, open-minded quest for the truth, no matter where that leads us.
Yeah, I like to think about science as a spiritual practice. It's a deep engagement with the mystery. It has, formal practices. It has, all the qualities that I define in a transformative practice. You set intention, you formulate a hypothesis, you pay attention, you watch, you manipulate, you reproduce, you build on other people's work, and ultimately you marvel at the wonder.
There have been experiences, I'm sure everybody's had this, where as a teenager or a young adult or something, you see somebody across the room. I saw a girl and our eyes clicked and I thought, okay, there's some connection here. Then my mind got into action and said, wait a minute, that's just rubbish. That was just a chance encounter of two people and their eyes happened to click. It doesn't really mean anything. I should just finish the conversation I'm having here and not worry about that. And that's the way I lived my life. My life was a control experiment. I was rational. I didn't worry about that. Now that I see psi phenomena and I see that these things exist, and I know that synchronicity exists, it's a manifestation of that, I see how stupid I was. That there were many sorts of little connections and little opportunities I totally have missed because of my rational mind at the time.
I'm sure Dr. Bingston would be the first person to say that we've got a long way to go before doctors open up to this possibility that something real is happening here. He has done 3 independent studies now that at major academic institutions showing that he can heal animals who have been transplanted with mammary cancer, cancer that's identical to breast cancer in women. And these medical institutions were actually horrified by his results. He was practically banished from one of them, and he talks about this in his book on this subject. But my point is that we have a huge hurdle before we can intelligently certify or pedigree anyone who wants to do this kind of work. We have first to recognize the data and the legitimacy of the phenomenon.
I would very much like to be able to cure a wart. I can't. I can do metastatic cancer, but I can't do a wart. Now, try to wrap yourself around that.
Science has always been based on assumptions, hypotheses, which are best guess estimates for how the universe works, and those hypotheses stand until they've been proven incorrect, and then they're replaced by something a little bit more current that takes into account the latest data and information. Materialism, for example, is one of the longest standing hypotheses in science. And it's not a coincidence that science is inherently materialistic, and so is all of Western civilization. They're one and the same thing. All of our schools, our universities, our institutions, the medical profession, and even our governments have been heavily influenced by this dogmatically held belief of the scientific community that there's nothing beyond the physical world. If we're ever going to understand what life really is, though, we're going to have to drop this outdated hypothesis of materialism and replace it with something a little bit more contemporary.
You look at all sorts of things that we're supposed to accept right now. Fluoridation, we're supposed to accept. I grew up with the idea that pesticides were fine because the body was able to reject them and they killed the bugs, and so we were better off. We have the idea of GMOs, which is very much analogous to what we used to be saying about pesticides. The idea of smog, about the idea that all sorts of things, electromagnetic fields, oh, they won't hurt us, they're non-ionizing radiation. All of these ideas are based upon very little perspectives, very small views. And we're learning from this broader view how wrong we are, But yet it's going to take quite a while for the mainstream to get back to this. And so yes, the Earth will survive, we will survive. We're doing a lot of damage on the way.
This is actually the failure of science. Science is supposed to have been an open-minded field of information, where that as new information comes in, we readily adopt and adapt it to conform. And yet we bought into precise definitions that when we start to get out of that definition, it really becomes an irritant to those that are supporting that definition, and that keeps us back in the box. So really, it's a time for us to recognize we must become real scientific in the sense, if there's an observation, it must be understood from a scientific foundation.
My stuff and other people's stuff, and in the SSE, all the stuff that's talked about in the SSE, they don't fit. And so we call them anomalies. In other words, things that ought not to be. Doesn't mean that they don't be, it means that they ought not to be. So should you be able to put your hands around a cage of cancerous mice and fix the mice? No. I mean, not by any understanding of the world that I know. And so does that mean it didn't happen? No, it just means I got to go back and rethink. And it's in that context that I say, lighten up on the belief system, folks. We're all wrong. We're all wrong.
Yeah, we're doing things wrong, but look, so I took a course once on jazz piano, and in the first lecture, the instructor, who was a great jazz pianist, said the way that you learn jazz piano, it goes through 3 stages. The first stage is that you just sit down and you play. And you play and you play and you listen and you play. Then he said the second stage is you go and you learn the theory. And you learn the basic theory and understanding and the chord structures and everything else. And then he said the third stage is forgetting the second stage and going back and playing. But you're doing it on a deeper level. And I think that we're sort of doing that now. We started with a understanding of the world as being consciousness-based. This is ancient. Then we came to this materialistic view. We're sort of learning the mechanistic theory with this materialistic view. Now we're on the verge of saying, wait a minute, consciousness is in fact the basis of reality, but we're going to do this on a profounder level now.
In the dimensions of space and time, we've always been able to rely on our five senses to help us comprehend and operate in the world that we live in. But in our attempts to navigate to and connect with our souls, not only are these tools useless, but they provide the minds with so much useless information that it makes the job that much more difficult to even make the connection. But we do have access to other sensory input that modern science regards as just useless information or just noise, but that in the physics of the soul is regarded as vital in helping us come to a much deeper understanding about the truth of nature. And possibly the most important of these tools are emotions.
Emotions are very important because they illuminate inner dynamics in you. For example, as you become aware of your emotions, you become aware of parts of your personality that originate in fear and parts of your personality that originate in love. Now, how can I say this so casually? Because you can validate this, you can verify this for yourself. I suggest that you not take anything that I say to you as so, simply because I'm saying it, or because I wrote a book about it. I also suggest that you not take anything that anyone says to you as so, simply because they wrote a book about it, or they're standing on a podium saying it. Experiment with it. See for yourself if what I'm suggesting resonates with you. If it doesn't, throw it away. Don't try to wear a shoe that doesn't fit. But if I say anything that feels as though it could be valuable to you, that touches you in some meaningful way, then hold on to it, like you'd hold on to a dream, because you know that it will be helpful to you to remember that dream, and then experiment with it. Experiment with it.
The soul is absolutely beyond space and time. It is in the superluminal realm of nature, a real realm not believed by orthodox science because their tools can't discriminate it. And therefore to them, they have no experience of these things. Therefore it can't possibly exist. But there's lots and lots and lots and lots of people who have inner experiences.
This is not only scientific dynamite, it's also theological dynamite, because it reinvigorates the old idea of the soul, which we say is something about us that wasn't born, it doesn't die, it's infinite, it's eternal. And this is essentially the vision that we are creating by the new experiments that show that consciousness can reach out infinitely in space and time and affect others.
The distance-time world is subluminal. All the processes that go on are slower than the velocity of light. And we perceive these with our eyesight, and we have instruments that can perceive these. The superluminal is faster than the velocity of light. It's invisible to our sensory systems and invisible to all the measurement instruments of orthodox science.
Eventually, you will come to understand that love heals everything, and there's nothing but love.
My working hypothesis, one of many, is that love is the universal solvent.
And learning to choose love instead of choosing fear requires commitment, it requires courage, it requires tools like emotional awareness and responsible choice. And it requires a scientist's mind, because after a while you can begin to make the connection between your choices of intention and your experiences. Now we are entering a new realm of science that is not yet nascent, it's only in potential. This is the physics of the soul. Your soul wants harmony and cooperation and sharing and reverence for life. Your emotions show you, one by one, the parts of your personality that do not want those things. In other words, the parts of your personality that prevent you from aligning your personality with your soul. You feel angry and you don't care about harmony or cooperation. You feel jealous and you don't care about reverence for life. You feel superior or inferior, and you don't care about sharing, but your soul does. And your meaning in life now depends upon aligning yourself with your soul, with that part of your being that wants harmony and cooperation and sharing and reverence for life. Doing that is the creation of authentic power, and you do it by finding all of the parts of your personality, those that originate in love and those that originate in fear, because those that originate in fear are not aligned with your soul. And if they remain unconscious in you, prevent you from aligning with your soul. And you cannot give the gifts that you were born to give without aligning your personality with your soul, which means you can't give them when you're angry or jealous or looking for sex or pornography or shopping or gambling, or all you can think about is whether or not your paper's going to get published, or whether or not someone's going to beat you to your own great discovery. Well, a lot of people already have. And your own great discovery is going to be that you are a powerful and creative, compassionate and loving spirit.
You know, Larry Dossey wrote a wonderful book, Be Careful What You Pray For. You know, oftentimes we're not really aware of what the overall purpose or bigger goal is of something, and so we try to influence things to go our way, when in fact consciousness transformation is really about yielding, about accepting what is so just for what is so.
I happen to believe that the fear of death and complete annihilation with physical death probably has caused more suffering in the history of the human race than all of the physical diseases combined. I happen to believe also that the promise of immortality that's suggested by the new consciousness research is kind of a great cure for this great disease, this fear of death that haunts modern man. And I think this is probably the greatest contribution that the new consciousness data makes to human welfare.
It's really easy to feel defeated in the face of all the complexities of our time. You know, we can turn on the evening news and see all the suffering that's happening. And yet, I think that change is possible. It's inevitable. And we can see it looking back just in the last, 50, 40, 30 years, thinking about the human rights movement or women's empowerment movement, or thinking about racism and the ways in which we've fought for greater equality. Looking at the field of mind-body medicine. When I started in this field, it was heresy. You didn't try to connect the mind and the body. And the idea that there were some ways that we could enhance our own mental hygiene, to improve our physical well-being, was considered just utter nonsense. And today it is widespread in medical centers all over the world. So change happens. And I think as more and more people are awakening to their own suffering, to their own capacity to grow in the midst of suffering and to transform, to flourish, then they will be hungry to find more and more answers that will help us to alleviate the suffering and to work together to improve the human condition.
If you entertain a belief system that the universe is alive and wise and compassionate, that it co-creates with you and you co-create with it in meaningful ways to bring into being the most effective circumstances for you and opportunities for you to grow spiritually as you move through your life on the earth, that belief system expands you. It opens you. If you believe in a universe that is fearsome, merciless, or fickle at the very best, that closes you down. If you believe in a universe of love, of compassion, that opens you. Well, these are belief systems. So what I suggest is that you experiment. If you feel most drawn to a belief system now that closes you, experiment. Open your mind, because eventually your heart will open.
If we were to take a look at the entire human race as a single organism, we wouldn't need a doctor to tell us that the patient's not doing very well right now, physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, and even spiritually. And unfortunately, especially here in the West, when a patient's not doing very well, the first people we turn to are medical health professionals and scientists to help us come up with the latest wonder drug to cure whatever's ailing us. But when the very people we turn to help make us better are the very ones who've made us sick in the first place, maybe it's time we looked elsewhere to be healed. It's time for all of us to become healed, individually as well as collectively. And it's time for Mother Earth to be healed too. And in spite of all of the upheaval on the planet right now, this truly is an amazing time to be alive. Thanks for watching.
The planet devastated from what we created. Easy too late for this crucial state. The planet devastated from what we created. Easy too late for this crucial state. What? Planet devastated from what we created. Easy too late for this crucial state. Come no, planet devastated from what we created. Easy too late for this crucial state. Joy. Oh, I hope it's not so. We gotta get ourselves together now. Check it out. We gotta figure out what's soon that. Well, other people them are living to the new